hello there. I'm back. My name is Leia, and today we have another episode of Beauty and the Bibliophile. If you're new here, welcome to my channel. If you're not new here, thank you for returning. As often as I can, I do a series called Beauty and the Bibliophile, where I do my makeup and I tell you about the latest book that I've read. If you don't know what a bibliophile is, it is a lover and a collector of books. That would be me. Today's book is Cold Hearted, and it is the 8th book in the Villains series by Serena Valentino. Now, spoiler alerts. If you are thinking about reading this book and you don't want to know anything about it, do not watch this video. If you don't want to read the book, but you still want to know the story and hear a summary of it, I can't go into everything. It would just be way too long of a video. This one's already gonna be probably pretty long. A lot happened in this book, but you will know the ending. Also, if you haven't seen the Disney movie Cinderella, where have you been? You're probably not gonna understand a whole lot of this story. So I would suggest watching that first before watching this video or reading this book. Also, one more thing. This is a book in a series of books. So if you haven't seen my other videos on the books prior to this one, again, you're going to be very lost. So I would suggest watching those, and I will link them below before you watch this video. Whew, we got a lot going on today. Okay, so if all that sounds good to you, then stay tuned. Now, not long ago in the many kingdoms, there was an old chateau. And this chateau was special for two reasons. One, it was the old home of Queen Cinderella. And two, it was the subject of wild rumors. It was said to be haunted by Lady Tremaine and her two daughters. If you're curious about any of the products that I will be using, I will be listing them in the description box below. Anastasia and Drizella were said to roam the halls in white, tattered wedding dresses, and it was said that Lady Tremaine had been seen talking to the ghost of her cat, Lucifer. Now, these rumors told a tragic ghost story, but the truth was far more interesting. The truth was they were all very much alive, despite their wraith-like appearance. And they were trapped within the chateau with their mother because, unlike Cinderella, the Tremaines didn't have a fairy godmother. Now, I assume you've all heard Cinderella's story. We all know that her mother died when she was very young, and that her father looked for a new wife to take care of her. He wasn't looking to fall in love. He had done that already. He needed someone that could care for his house and his daughter. He also needed someone with a large dowry, which Lady Tremaine fit all these things. He was also looking for someone from a good family, which she also was. She was very stately and reserved and handsome, and she had a fortune of her own, which, upon marrying him, would become his. But we'll get to all that here shortly. Cinderella had heard about her stepsister's sad circumstances, and she couldn't ignore it. Okay, I'm going to let my skincare sit in for a few minutes before we move on to makeup. So Cinderella wrote a letter to her fairy godmother asking her to come and help. Cinderella, for reasons that the fairy godmother understood, couldn't help them. So she needed her fairy godmother to come and help Anastasia, Drizella, and Cinderella as soon as she could. Now, when the fairy godmother received this letter, she was a little frustrated. The fairies were not in the business of helping the likes of the Tremaines. Now, the fairy godmother's sister, Nanny, she was there when the letter came. She'd actually been away for a while off on her own adventures, and she had just recently returned to the fairylands. And the two of them were just about to sit down for tea when they got Cinderella's message. Now the fairy godmother's sister Nanny, she was like, oh, you have to go to Cinderella. You have a duty to your charge. You can't ignore her. Besides, aren't you interested in like what's going on? What could have happened to Anastasia and Drizella? It must be something horrible for her to write you like this. The fairy godmother didn't really want to go. Her nerves were still settling from the ordeal they had just been through. They had just been through an attack by the Odd Sisters, and then before that they had been attacked by Maleficent. But the fairy godmother told Nanny that the Tremaines are not fairy worthy. I will not help them. Besides, I know why you really want me to go and help. You feel guilty about what happened to them and your part in it. You also feel bad about what just happened to Cersei. Now, when Nanny heard her say this last part about Cersei, she looked at her like, like the fairy godmother had just slapped her across the face or something. Now, the fairy godmother knew she shouldn't have said that, especially since Nanny is still grieving Cersei. But as far as the fairy godmother was concerned, everything was taken care of now. Cersei and her mothers, the Odd Sisters, were perfectly safe and fine in the place between. That's where they are right now. Far away from the fairylands and the mini kingdoms where they couldn't hurt anybody. As far as the fairy godmother was concerned, it was taken care of, it was put to rest. All they had to do now was make sure nothing like that ever happened again, which meant not getting tangled up with the likes of the Tremaines. But of course, her sister Nanny, as usual, was Hades bent on getting them all up involved and in danger. And Nanny was sick of arguing with the fairy godmother, so she decided to go and get her magic mirror so that she could see for herself what was going on with Anastasia and Drizella. So her and the fairy godmother, they look into the magic mirror and they can see that Anastasia and Drizella are in a deplorable state. They're wearing tattered white dresses. The chateau is in ruins. It's crumbling all around them. And they can hear Lady Tremaine in the background ranting and raving about everything that she had lost. Nanny is like, we have to do something. This is horrendous. She's like, why hasn't Cinderella done anything to help them? And the fairy godmother, she had to confess, it's kind of her fault. She had put a spell on the chateau and the Tremaines and Cinderella so that they would never meet again. Nanny's like, so they're trapped in that house? She's like, you have to do something. You have to lift the enchantment so the girls can leave that horrible place. And the fairy godmother's like, no. She's like, I won't do it. I won't ruin Cinderella's happily ever after, especially for those girls. Anastasia and Drizella are getting exactly what they deserve. And Nanny's like, but I was their nanny. She's like, I know what they went through. She's like, they don't deserve this. Why was their fate written so tragically while Cinderella's life was so charmed? And the fairy godmother was like, Cinderella's life was not charmed. She was tortured by the Tremaines. They're lucky they got off so easily. Most storybook villains do not get off so easily. They usually meet a less kind fate. And the fairy godmother's like, besides, this is nonsense. She's like, you were there. You know that the Tremaines didn't need any encouragement by the Odd Sisters to treat Cinderella so irreprehensibly. They did that on their own accord. She's like, you know it. You read it for yourself in the book of fairy tales that Snow White sent us after Cersei passed. And Nanny's like, okay, fine, let's read it. You know, perhaps, Lady Tremaine, there will be no redemption for her, but surely after you hear this story, even you will want to help Anastasia and Drizella. So the fairy godmother, she went and she grabbed the book of fairy tales and she's like, fine. She's like, maybe my sister will finally stop pestering me to help those girls once she sees how monstrous they really were. So then she begins to read Lady Tremaine's story. Now, Lady Tremaine lived in London and she had gotten married to her first husband and they were very much in love, but she lost him early in the marriage and she was left to take care of their 2 daughters alone. Now, luckily, you know, her husband had done very well for himself and she was taken care of. Plus, she herself had come from a wealthy family and had her own money. So between their 2 combined wealths, she was just fine. She had plenty of money. She didn't need anything. She didn't want anything. She was very wealthy. She had everything she desired except for one thing, and that was her true love. She just lost him far too early. Now, like a lot of wealthy Londoners, they would kind of flitter back and forth between the city and the country. And one day, Lady Tremaine decided to go visit her really good friend, Lady Prudence Hackle, who lived out in the country, and they were very good friends. They even had plans for their children to marry. Lady Tremaine was going to have her daughters, Anastasia and Drizella, marry Lady Hackle's 2 boys, Richard and Charles. Now, it had been 6 years since her husband had passed, and it was just recently that she was kind of starting to feel like herself again. And that included, you know, being social. And she was kind of maybe wondering lately if it was time for her to find a new companion, a new husband. Now, her daughters, Anastasia was 11 and Drizella was 12, had become quite a handful lately. And Lady Tremaine, you know, she admitted that she had kind of spoiled them since their father passed, since she, you know, she felt bad for them. She would give them whatever they pleased. She doted on them. She took them on holidays all the time. If they wanted a new dress, they got it. But because of this, they were becoming harder and harder to please and were becoming harder and harder to discipline as well. And Lady Tremaine secretly kind of dreamed of the day when they would finally be married off and she could kind of have a life to herself again. Now, Lady Tremaine was going to bring her daughters on this trip to her friends out in the country, but they had been such a handful lately and were constantly fighting. So as a punishment, she told them they couldn't go on the trip. And this was kind of okay with Lady Tremaine. She kind of was looking for some time alone to think, you know, all the thoughts she'd been having in her head lately about kind of moving on with her life. She also thought it would be nice to have some time where she wouldn't have to constantly be worried about her daughters embarrassing her. The only person that came with her on this trip was her lady's maid, Mrs. Bramble. And when they arrived at the estate, Lady Tremaine and Mrs. Bramble were escorted to their room so that they could settle in and change for dinner. And while they were in there, Mrs. Bramble says to Lady Tremaine that she's like, you know what all this is about, right? You know what Lady Hackle is up to, don't you? She's like, there's a gentleman she wants you to meet. It's kind of all the gossip downstairs. Downstairs means, you know, the help. She's like, she's got this entire party planned just so she can introduce you to. And nobody has ever heard of this guy. Nobody knows anything about him. They say he's from a very distant land and that he's looking for a wife. She's also like, there are some wild stories about this land that he's from. They say they call it the mini kingdoms and that there are some crazy tales. She's like, you should hear them. And Lady Tremaine's like, oh, that sounds like a bunch of just rumors and fairy tales. And Mrs. Bramble's like, oh no. She's like, they're not fairy tales. They're witch tales. Then she goes to her bag and she pulls out a book. She's like, "They're tales recorded by foul witches who meddle in the lives of women." Now, Lady Tremaine was starting to think there might be something a little amiss with her lady's maid. She was getting older. She had been with her and her family since she was a child. Maybe it was time for her to retire. Mrs. Bramble's like, "Here, you need to take this book and read it. There's something that happens to women. Women just like you, someone who's rich and smart and kind, with a tragic past. Something will change you. I don't know if it's the many kingdoms or if it's the witches." Now, Lady Tremaine was becoming concerned that maybe Mrs. Bramble was like coming down with dementia or something. So to make her happy, she's like, "You know what, I'll read the book." She takes it from her and she's like, "But you know what, the rest of the day I want you to rest." And Mrs. Bramble gets concerned. She's like, "Oh, but well, who will help you get dressed?" And she's like, "Oh, don't worry, I'm sure Lady Hackle will have someone she can spare that can help me." She's like, "Don't you worry, you go rest." So she leaves to go rest, and Lady Hackle did send someone up, a pretty girl with chestnut hair named Rebecca. So she helps her get dressed, and then Lady Tremaine goes down to dinner. And at dinner, she met the mysterious Sir Richard. Now, when Lady Tremaine saw him, she was like, "Oh my God." She was like, "They do not make men like him in London." He was almost too perfect, with chiseled features and a strong jaw. He had a boyish charm. He made everybody laugh. I know someone like that. After they were introduced, Lady Tremaine asked Sir Richard, she's like, "So, tell me about these many kingdoms." And he was like, "Oh, well, you know, our court is a peaceful court." He's like, "Luckily, we've been able to stay out of all the drama in the book of fairy tales, and we intend to keep it that way." And Lady Tremaine was thinking to herself, she's like, "That's kind of a funny thing to say." She's like, she asks him, she's like, "Book of fairy tales?" She's like, "Oh, it's real then?" She's like, "I've heard people talk about it." And she was wondering, like, is this the same book of fairy tales that Mrs. Bramble had just given her? Sir Richard said, "Oh, it's real." He's like, but you know, it's greatly exaggerated." Then they were seated for dinner, and they were seated next to each other. They were chatting, and they started telling each other all about each other's lives and about their children. She told him about Anastasia and Drizella. She kept it a little vague, though. She didn't want to scare him away with tales of her two wicked daughters. And then he told her all about his angelic, perfect Cinderella that was just the treasure of his life. Now, the next morning, Rebecca comes in with Lady Tremaine's breakfast, and Lady Tremaine asked her how Mrs. Bramble was doing, and Rebecca was like, "Oh, you know, I think she could probably use another day of rest. She's still not quite herself." Lady Tremaine was kind of thinking, maybe I should just send her back home to London. But she just thought, "Oh, I'll just give her another day of rest, see how she does." And Rebecca helped Lady Tremaine get ready for the day because Lady Hackle had arranged a little picnic, a little outing for all her guests. Rebecca also told Lady Tremaine about something Mrs. Bramble had asked her to do. She asked her to hold on to something for her, but Rebecca didn't feel right about it because this thing belonged to Lady Tremaine. Rebecca handed Lady Tremaine a small satin box, and she was like, "Yeah, Mrs. Bramble told me not to give this to you. She said something about it being like cursed by a witch or a pirate or something." And Lady Tremaine took the box, and she knew exactly what was in it. She opened it, and there was an oval jade brooch. When she opened it and looked at the brooch, it made her kind of sad. Her husband had given it to her. They had been walking through the park one day, and he insisted that they take an alternate route home, and they came upon this little pawn shop. Obviously, he'd been planning this from the very beginning. She remembered it like it was yesterday. When they went into the shop, the shopkeeper asked him if there was anything that he could help them with, and her husband looks in the case and he's like, oh, can I see that item right there? And this shopkeeper, he pulls out a little tray with a number of other items on it, and Lady Tremaine sees the brooch and she thinks it's just beautiful. She's almost mesmerized by it. And the shopkeeper's like, oh yes, he's like, this has a very interesting story. He said, I bought this whole tray of items from a dealer who said that it was cursed by like a witch or a pirate or something. And he also had a book of fairy tales that was supposedly written by witches. But Lady Tremaine and her husband just kind of chalked it up to something that he told customers to make them more interested in the items. Now, if you remember, in the Cruella book, her dad had bought her a pair of jade earrings that were also said to have been cursed by a pirate or a witch, or found by a pirate or something like that. So Lady Tremaine, she takes kind of one last sad look at the brooch and she sets it on her vanity. She's not going to wear it to the picnic. It wouldn't be appropriate, but maybe she would wear it to dinner that night. Then Rebecca says to Lady Tremaine, she's like, I hope you don't, mind me saying so, but I think Mrs. Bramble, she may be getting a little on in age. She was kind of rambling about how this brooch, had been cursed or something. And, that's when Lady Tremaine, she recalled the conversation with the shopkeeper, and she remembered him mentioning some kind of a curse and a book of fairy tales. And she wondered if that was the same book of fairy tales that Mrs. Bramble had just given her. But she couldn't really remember, like, the thing with the shopkeeper had been so long ago, the memory was a little vague. Now, at the picnic, Sir Richard asked Lady Tremaine if she'd like to go for a walk. And on the walk, he starts, telling her all about his home, how lovely it was. He told her, like, how lonely he had been since his wife passed and how he was looking for companionship. He also needed, a mother for his daughter. And he talked about combining their wealth, to secure a future for their children and for themselves. He didn't speak of love, though, but Lady Tremaine assumed it was implied since he was talking about, companionship. Now that evening, right before dinner, all the guests are still milling about, he comes over to her and he takes her by the hand and he's like, can I talk to you for a second? And he leads her out of some double doors that go out into a garden. And he has a very serious look on his face, and Lady Tremaine doesn't know what he's about to say, but she figures whatever he's about to say is gonna disappoint her, because it's just the kind of look he had on his face. He said, I'm afraid I have to leave back home right after dinner, and I didn't want to just leave without talking to you first, given the conversation we had earlier. He's like, I wanted to make sure there was, kind of misunderstanding. And when he said this, her heart kind of sank. She felt kind of foolish, Of course, he didn't want to start some romantic love affair. It had just been small talk. And she's like, oh, you needn't say more. I understand perfectly. And he's like, do you? He's like, do you really understand? Because, I really want to make my intentions clear here. And she's like, say no more, Sir Richard. I completely understand. So they go into the dining room and they sit down for dinner, and Lady Tremaine, she's very glad that she wore her brooch to dinner because she felt like, it gave her a little bit more, made her stronger. She felt like she would have cried, but she didn't. She didn't want to make a fool of herself. And she felt like the brooch helped her do that. Anyway, so she's sitting there thinking this, and then she sees Sir Richard and Lady Hackle exchange a knowing look. Then Lady Hackle stands up to give a toast, and she's like, "Dear friends, please join me in congratulating my best friend, Lady Tremaine and Sir Richard, in their engagement." She's like, "May they both be truly happy as they join their families." And Lady Tremaine's sitting there kind of shocked. But then she realized, oh my gosh, me and my girls, we're gonna get our happily ever after now. I mean, she was marrying a knight from a kingdom she didn't know anything about, but still, a knight. Now, after dinner, they got a moment alone, and Sir Richard was like, I'm so sorry that I have to dash off like this. I know we have a lot to talk about, but my king summoned me and I have to go. He's like, but I really, really want you and your daughters to join me in the mini kingdoms. He's like, won't you leave with me now? And she's like, well, I can't go right now. She's like, I haven't even told my girls yet. She's like, I gotta pack up my house and arrange for the sale of my home and, arrange for passage for me, the girls, and my servants. And Sir Richard's like, oh, no. He's like, there's no need for you to bring anything except your most personal belongings. He's like, my house is beautifully furnished and fully staffed. And, if you want, bring your lady's maid and your governess to keep you company on your journey. But once you get to my house, he's like, you won't need them anymore. He's like, please come with me. He's like, I need you by my side. He's looking deeply into her eyes. And then there was a knock at the door, and it was Sir Richard's valet. He comes in, he's like, I'm sorry, but we need to get going if we're gonna catch the ship. And Sir Richard's like, okay. He's like, well, I better be off. And Lady Tremaine thought this was when he was gonna kiss her. And she's closing her eyes, waiting. And then she feels a peck on her forehead. He's like, goodbye, my dear. He's like, come to me quickly. I can't wait for you to be my wife. And then he leaves. And Lady Tremaine's a little confused. He wouldn't kiss her. She's like, does he really love me? Maybe, she's thinking to herself, maybe he just didn't feel comfortable showing affection in front of his valet. But, there wasn't time to talk about it now. Now, after he left, she goes back to her room, and Mrs. Bramble is sitting there crying. She's like, what's the matter? And Mrs. Bramble's like, I heard you're moving to the mini kingdoms. And she's like, well, how do you know that? She's like, I barely just decided that myself. And Mrs. Bramble's like, please don't go. I'm telling you, something bad is gonna happen. She's like, please read the book of fairy tales that I gave you. She's like, it's all in there. I'm going to be using an appropriate palette. She's like, nothing's gonna happen to me. She's like, you don't have to worry. And Mrs. Bramble's like, she's like, not worried about you. She's like, I'm worried about who you're going to hurt. She's like, there's something that happens to stepmothers in the mini kingdoms. She's like, I'm worried about those you will destroy with your hate and cruelty. And just then, Rebecca comes into the room. She had heard that last part she said, and she's like, how dare you? She's like, my lady does not have a cruel bone in her body. And Mrs. Bramble's like, well, she will when you and your witches are through with her. She's like, it happens to all of them. It happens to all the stepmothers in the mini kingdoms. And she turns back to Lady Tremaine with the book of fairy tales again. She's like, please, my lady, please just read this book. She's like, please, before you make the biggest mistake of your life. And Lady Tremaine, she again took the book from her and she promised that she would read it. Then Lady Tremaine noticed an inscription on the book, an inscription from Lord Tremaine. And she's like, this was from Lord Tremaine's library? She says to Mrs. Bramble, and Mrs. Bramble's like, yeah. She's like, I thought you knew. He said that he got it from the same shop where he got your brooch. She's like, he always let the staff borrow his books. And Lady Tremaine was like, oh, okay. She's like, well, thank you for returning it. So then she had Rebecca take Mrs. Bramble back to her room to rest again. And after she left, she's like looking at the book after, you know, Rebecca leaves. Lady Tremaine is looking at the book. And she remembered what Sir Richard had said about it possibly kind of being like a history of the many kingdoms. She's wondering, like, could the stories actually be true? So the next day, her and Rebecca were in a whirl trying to get everything situated. She was going to be going back home to London first. She's going to tell the girls about what was going on and, you know, get her personal things and then arrange for the sale of her house. But then she received a letter from Sir Richard. He must have, you know, mailed it or had it sent or whatever, like right before he got on the ship. And again, it was like begging her to come as soon as possible. He wanted her to like have her girls meet her at the dock and then come all together instead of her going home first. Now, of course, Lady Tremaine was very overwhelmed with everything that would have to be done in order to do this. But Rebecca and Lady Prudence Hackle, they both like assured Lady Tremaine that, you know, they would help her, they would take care of everything that they could. All they needed was for Nanny Pinch back home, the girls' governess, to bring them there so that, you know, Lady Tremaine could meet them. So they could handle, you know, everything else. And they managed to pull it off. You know, Nanny Pinch and the girls met Lady Tremaine and Rebecca at the dock. Now on the ship, Lady Tremaine explained everything that was going on to the girls. And that, you know, she was marrying Sir Richard and that he had a little girl just their age and they were all going to be great friends. And surprisingly, the girls were excited. They were like, oh, well, where in the many kingdoms are we living? What do we call it? And Lady Tremaine was like, oh, you know what? I don't know. So she asks Rebecca what the kingdom is called. And she goes, oh, you're going to be living in King Hubert's lands. Now, I was a little confused on this part because I thought King Hubert was Prince Philip's father, not Prince Charming. Prince Charles, I think, is the prince's name in Cinderella. I don't think it's the same guy. Anyway, that's where she says they're living. She's like, it's not far from the Beast King and the Queen Belle. Then Lady Tremaine asks Rebecca for the book of fairy tales. She wanted to read it on their journey. But Rebecca, she was like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I packed it in the crates that, you know, are down in the cargo hold. She's like, I can't get it until we get to the many kingdoms and unpack. Now, the story didn't say how long it took them to get to the many kingdoms, but when they did, they arrived in Morning Star Kingdom. Sir Richard had arranged for a carriage to pick them up, so they get in the carriage and they're passing through the many kingdoms and they see one kingdom that had a tall stone tower, and then they passed the dead woods, and then they passed where the Beast King lived. And Rebecca knew a whole lot about the many kingdoms, and she's telling them all the history as they're traveling through the many kingdoms. And Lady Tremaine's thinking, she's like, how does Rebecca know all this? She's like, she never mentioned having grown up there or having ever lived there, so she didn't really know how Rebecca knew all this. So when they get to Sir Richard's chateau, he comes running out of the house and he kind of quickly introduces Lady Tremaine, Anastasia, and Drizella to his daughter Cinderella. And then he's like, well, okay, we better get off to the wedding chapel. The vicar is expecting us soon. And Lady Tremaine's like, oh, I didn't know we were getting married today. She's like, the dress I plan to wear isn't here, neither are any of my other things. And Sir Richard's like, well, you know, I can't have a woman, you know, sleeping at my house that I'm not married to and that, you know, isn't a servant or something. It's like, it wouldn't be proper. Now, Lady Tremaine did not like this idea at all. She had just gotten there and they were literally going to leave right then. She hadn't even gone into the house yet. But at the same time, she felt like it couldn't be helped. She didn't want to, you know, start some kind of a scandal in the many kingdoms before they were even married. So the girls go inside and her and Richard leave for the chapel. And there, the vicar really like hurried the ceremony along, and he had his own wife, you know, be the witness, and they signed the paperwork immediately. There were no flowers, there was no cake, no kisses, there was no friends or family there. Excuse me. There was no friends or family there. No one even like thought to like maybe put some flowers together for her to hold. It felt very much like, I mean, she was the bride. She's supposed to be the celebrated one. And she felt like an afterthought and alone. Everything felt like such a formality. Nothing like what she was expecting. Outside the chapel, the Duke was waiting for Sir Richard. And he sees them and he's like, oh, so you've done the deed, have you? And Sir Richard's like, yes. And he's like, good man. And you have your paperwork all, you know, signed and ready to go? And Sir Richard's like, yes, I do. The Duke's like, okay, great. You can come with me to the castle. And Lady Tremaine's like, you have to go register our marriage paperwork right now? He's like, oh yeah, I can't be helped. I have to go now. So Sir Richard goes to the castle with the Duke, and Lady Tremaine goes back home all alone. And when she got home, she starts looking around. She's a little disappointed. My eye is watering and it is really messing stuff up. Yeah, it wasn't exactly what she was expecting. It was a beautiful home, but it wasn't as grand as her own home back in London. And it needed some work. She was going to have a lot to do to bring it up to her standards. I'm making it worse. Oh God. Oh God. Oh God. Anyway, so she's walking around the house. She notices how empty it is as well. She's thinking like, where are all the servants? Just then a little round-faced woman comes down the stairs and she says, oh, Lady Tremaine, welcome home. And Lady Tremaine's like, oh, well, thank you, miss. And she's like, oh, Mrs. Butterpants. Remember Mr. Butterpants from the Gothel story? I think this is his sister. Anyway, she's like, yeah, I was the head housekeeper and Cinderella's governess. And Lady Tremaine is like, was? And she's like, yeah. She's like, Sir Richard didn't tell you? She's like, they told me that, you know, they didn't need my services anymore now that Cinderella has a stepmother. And Lady Tremaine's like, oh, okay. Well, she's like, do you already have other employment lined up? Like, what are you gonna do? And she's like, oh, I'm gonna help my brother with his bakery. She's like, that's what I'm gonna do from now on. And Lady Tremaine's like, okay. And then she asks, she's like, well, where are all the other servants? And Mrs. Butterpants is like, there are no other servants. Now later, Lady Tremaine is in her bedroom unpacking, and Anastasia and Drizella come in, and they're kind of upset. They're like, Mom, we thought you were bringing us to a magical kingdom. She's not an old stone chateau out in the middle of nowhere. They're like, we can't even see the castle from here. And just then, Cinderella comes into the room, and she heard the last thing that they said, and she goes, oh no, she's like, that's not true. You can see it from the attic tower. And Drizella, hearing this, she kind of rolls her eyes like, why would you want to be in the attic? And Lady Tremaine sees her and she's like, now, she's like, let's all get along and be nice to your new sister. And Anastasia's like, she is not our sister. She's like, now, girls. She's like, why don't we sit down and I'll try to get to know each other. So Cinderella sits down and she says, well, I hope you're enjoying my mother's home, Lady Tremaine. And Lady Tremaine was taken aback, and Cinderella, seeing her reaction, said, you know, my papa said that this will always be my mama's house, no matter who calls herself lady of the house. And, you know, Lady Tremaine, she understood, like, what Cinderella was saying, but at the same time, it was very hurtful. So Lady Tremaine, she gains her composure after this shocking statement from this little girl. And she says, you know, I really wish you could find it in your heart to call me mama. And Cinderella is like, but you're not my mama. She's like, I could call you stepmother. And Lady Tremaine's like, okay. She's like, if that's what you want, if that's the best she could get out of her, I guess she would take it for now. Now, over the next several weeks, Sir Richard had to stay at the castle on some kind of official business. And Lady Tremaine was actually okay with this. It gave her time to get the house in order, buy all new furniture, hire the servants. I mean, he had said he wanted her to manage the household, so that's what she was doing. And she was able to hire a new nanny whose name just happened to be Nanny. Now, during this time, she also found out that Rebecca had forgotten to pack the book of fairy tales. And Lady Tremaine was pretty disappointed because she had wanted to read that book. But, you know, she wasn't that mad at Rebecca because she figured, you know, it probably would still show up. But Rebecca felt really bad about it. So as like an apology gift or to make up for it, she got Lady Tremaine a little kitten. And Lady Tremaine loved the kitten. And she was playing with it. And the kitten tore her dress with his nails. And Lady Tremaine was like, oh, well, you little devil. She's like, that's the perfect name for you. I'm going to call you Lucifer since you're so mischievous. And Rebecca was like, Lucifer? She was a little confused. And Lady Tremaine's like, yeah, you know, the devil, the ruler of the underworld. And Rebecca's like, oh, like Hades. She's laughing. She's like, yeah, that's the perfect name for him. Now, when Sir Richard returned from his business at the castle, he was really upset. He asked to speak with Lady Tremaine alone. He did not like all the changes that she had made. He's like, what is the meaning of this? Buying all new things and hiring a whole new staff. He's like, did I say you could do that? And Lady Tremaine was like, oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know I required your permission. And he's like, well, you do. He's like, I'm the lord of this domain. And she's like, well, if it's a matter of the expense, she's like, I assure you, she's like, I used my own money. And he was like, your own money? He was like, your money is now my money, and I will dictate how it is spent. He's like, and where are all my wife's things? Now, Lady Tremaine felt horrible about this. She didn't know he would react so poorly to her updating things. She also didn't think that all these shabby things like held meaning to him, which, duh, of course, like, I don't know, sounds a little narcissistic. She was like, oh, she's like, I'm so sorry. She's like, I donated them. And he got really pissed and he slammed his fist on the table. And he's like, oh, he's like, you have really overstepped. He's like, well, I guess there's nothing that we can do about it now, but you will fire the staff first thing in the morning. And she's like, but who will clean the house and make the meals and care for the children? And he's like, you will. He's like, so He's like, if you don't mind, I'd like to spend some time with my daughter. So the next day, Lady Tremaine did as he asked. She fired the staff, all except for Rebecca and Nanny, who Sir Richard, reluctantly agreed to let her keep. Lady Tremaine had lost everything. She lost her home back in London. She lost her money. And now Sir Richard even owned her dignity. So Lady Tremaine wrote her old solicitor, which is like kind of like a accountant or something, back home in London to see if there was any way of her getting out of this situation. But unfortunately, the laws in the many kingdoms said that, once you're married, a woman's money becomes her husband's. It wasn't really all that different from how things were done in London, but she was stuck. But, she hadn't really worried about it at the time. Based on Sir Richard's rank, she assumed that, he had more money than she did. But she soon found out that was not the case. Oh, my allergies are ruining my makeup life. Her solicitor had done some investigating and found out that Sir Richard had been penniless before he married her, and he needed to marry a woman of means in order to keep his estate. He was in a lot of debt to the crown, so this explains why he was so upset when she hired the staff, and why he was so eager to get her there and get married. So Lady Tremaine found herself miserable, depressed, and broke. So Lady Tremaine's days were now spent, cooking, cleaning, getting the firewood, doing the laundry, scrubbing the floors. She'd become a servant in her own house. And Cinderella was always there to remind her that, this was still her mother's house, and to remind her about how, oh, well, Mama didn't do it like that. And she would complain about how she missed how much her mother used to do things. But Lady Tremaine still had Nanny to help with the girls, and Rebecca to help her with her chores as much as she could. Now 5 long years passed, and one day Lady Tremaine found her girls, Anastasia and Drizella, in their room crying. She's like, what's the matter? And they're like, we hate it here. And their mother's like, yeah, I know. She's like, I hate it here too. But she's like, you want to know a little secret? She's like, I'm gonna write Lady Prudence and ask her for the money so that we can make passage back to London. She's like, I will get you out of this house one way or another. And Drizella was like, oh, thank you, Mama. So then she sits down to write this letter. She'd actually written Lady Hackle several times, but had never heard back from her. So this was kind of her last ditch effort to appeal to Lady Hackle. But as she's sitting there writing, Rebecca comes in and she's like, do you want me to deliver that letter in the mail in the village that you're writing to Lady Hackle there? And Lady Tremaine's like, oh yeah. She's like, thank you, please do, because Rebecca always delivered her letters for her. So Rebecca walks out, and then Lady Tremaine's thinking, well, how did she know I was writing Lady Hackle? But then I guess who else would she be writing? So after Rebecca leaves to mail the letter, Lady Tremaine's, she's kind of thinking to herself about how much she resents Cinderella for being treated like a princess while her and her daughters were used like servants and degraded at every opportunity. Then there was a knock at the door, and this was a little surprising because they never got visitors. And Lady Tremaine, she's walking towards the door and she's thinking, ooh, wouldn't it be awesome if it was the Duke to tell me that Sir Richard had been killed? And then she instantly felt bad for thinking that. So she opens the door, and there's 3 identical women standing there. 3 odd, identical looking women. We know who this is. And Lady Tremaine is like, can I help you? And the one in the middle is like, oh, we're here to help you. She's like, I'm Lucinda, and these are my sisters, Ruby and Martha. And we sense that you have a servant here by the name of Nanny. Is that true? They're like, please tell me you haven't given her your brooch. We notice that you're not wearing it. And Lady Tremaine is like, well, I don't know how that's any business of yours, but who are you exactly? And how do you know about my brooch? And they're like, oh, your story is very well known to us. We're watching it being written as we speak. She's like, we know you're a prisoner in your own home by Sir Richard and his brat daughter, Cinderella, but we can help. Then Ruby pulls a little bottle of something out of her pocket and holds it up. She's like, the laws in the mini kingdoms are very similar to the laws in London. If a man dies, all his money goes to his wife if there isn't a male heir. And Lady Tremaine, she kind of backs up and she's thinking, what are they suggesting? They're like, don't play dainty with us. We know that you were just wishing that he was dead. I mean, it really is the only option. It really is the only way out of this. And Lady Tremaine is thinking, are these the witches that Miss Bramble had warned her about? The authors of the fairy tale book? And Lady Tremaine is like, you should leave before I have someone throw you out. And they're like, and who are you going to call exactly? Your lady's maid is off mailing a letter to someone who's never going to receive it. And your nanny is so old that she's forgotten she's the most powerful witch in the mini kingdoms, aside from our sister Circe, of course. And she's only here to try and steal your brooch. You are quite literally alone and powerless. Then Martha placed the bottle in her hand. She was like, why don't you hold on to this, just in case. And if you ever need us, just go to any of your mirrors and call us, and we will show up. But before Lady Tremaine could reply, all of a sudden the witches go flying backward and the door slams. And Lady Tremaine turns around and Nanny is standing right there. And Lady Tremaine's like, what just happened? She's like, did you do that? And Nanny's like, never mind. She's like, you need to bring me your brooch. And Lady Tremaine's like, what do you want with my brooch? She's like, they just told me that you were going to try and get it from me. And Nanny's like, well, of course they want you to have it. It's cursed. They're trying to use it to control you. They weren't lying about that. She's like, I am here to retrieve it. But Rebecca kept stopping me. And Lady Tremaine is like, what does Rebecca have to do with any of this? She's like, and how did they know that my letters weren't making it to London? And Nanny's like, because the Odd Sisters were intercepting them. They have Rebecca working with them. Nanny is like, we have to give that brooch back to them. And Lady Tremaine's like, no. She's like, that's all she has left of her first husband. Then Nanny explains that, those women, that's the Odd Sisters. And Rebecca's been working with them. Rebecca thinks that she's helping you, but every time the Odd Sisters try to help somebody, it just turns out all wrong and makes things much worse. She's like, I have worked for you for 5 years and I have kept your secrets from Sir Richard. She's like, does that sound like someone who's plotting against you? And Lady Tremaine, she had to admit that that sounded right. And Lady Tremaine's like, she's like, what are you, some kind of fairy godmother or something? And Nanny's like, oh, no, that's my sister. Lady Tremaine's like, so you are some kind of a fairy. She's like, well, can't you use your magic to help me and my daughters? And Nanny looks at her pitifully and she's like, no, I can't. She's like, I'm not allowed to help a villain. And the Book of Fairy Tales has decreed that that's what you are. She's like, even me just like sending the odd sister's out of the house just now. She's like, I broke the rules and I'm gonna have to go back to the fairylands any moment now to face my punishment. And all of a sudden, she disappears. So Lady Tremaine goes directly to Rebecca's room and she starts rummaging through all her things looking for the letters. And she finds them under a squeaky floorboard. So it was true. Rebecca hadn't been mailing her letters, and that's why Lady Hackle had never gotten back to Lady Tremaine. She also found something else. The Book of Fairy Tales. So Lady Tremaine sits on the floor and she starts thumbing through it until she sees Cinderella's name. She reads her story and it says, once upon a time in a faraway land there was a tiny kingdom, peaceful, prosperous, and rich in romance and tradition. Here in a stately chateau there lived a widowed gentleman and his little daughter Cinderella. Although he was a kind and devoted father, and gave his beloved child every luxury and comfort, still he felt she needed a mother's care, and so he married again, choosing for his second wife a woman of good family with 2 daughters just Cinderella's age, by name Anastasia and Drizella. It was upon the untimely death of this good man, however, that the stepmother's true nature was revealed, cold, cruel, and bitterly jealous of Cinderella's charm and beauty. She was grimly determined to forward the interest of her own 2 awkward daughters. Thus, as time went by, the chateau fell into disrepair, for the family fortunes were squandered upon the vain and selfish stepsisters, while Cinderella was abused, humiliated, and finally forced to become a servant in her own house. And yet, through it all, Cinderella remained ever gentle and kind, for with each dawn she found new hope that someday her dreams of happiness would come true. Lady Tremaine's reading this. She goes, that's not true, and she slams the book closed. So she takes the book and the letters, she goes back to her room, and then, for some comfort, she puts on the brooch. Then all of a sudden, Sir Richard bursting into the door, he's like, what is this I hear about you and your daughters trying to leave the many kingdoms? She's like, I don't know what you're talking about. He's like, don't lie to me. He's like, Cinderella told me everything. He's like, what kind of a woman are you, abandoning her family? Then he turns around, he slams the door behind him, and he locks it. She cried and she banged on the door to be let out. She hated him like she didn't hate anybody, except for maybe Cinderella. She really hated Cinderella for telling him her secret. She would never forgive her. That evening, Sir Richard came back and he unlocked the door, and Lady Tremaine was standing there waiting for him. And she had that little bottle carefully hidden in the folds of her dress that those strange sisters had given her. She's like, where are my girls? He's like, they're in the kitchen where they belong since you dismissed Rebecca. And Lady Tremaine hadn't dismissed Rebecca. She wondered where she had gone. Had those odd sisters told her that she knew about the letters? She didn't know. But she did know that she only had one option left. Now from here on out, it's pretty much the movie. Cinderella's father dies. They end up making Cinderella their servant out of bitterness and hatred for her. And they get an invitation to the ball. And this is where we get a different point of view of the ball. We don't see Cinderella's point of view, we see Lady Tremaine's. Now at the ball, while Anastasia and Drizella are off getting some punch, Lady Tremaine runs in to Rebecca. And she's like, oh, what are you doing here, you witch? And Rebecca's like, oh, so you've figured out who I am, have you? And Lady Tremaine's like, well, you know, you're working with the odd sisters, so I assumed you're a witch too. And Rebecca starts laughing, and then something kind of strange happens. Everything around Lady Tremaine like slows down and then freezes in place. And then the odd sisters come walking up, and they're like, let us introduce you to our sister Circe. And Lucinda waves her hand, and right before Lady Tremaine's eyes, Rebecca transforms into a golden-haired, fair-faced woman. And Circe's like, all four of us are the odd sisters. And we can see that you're walking down a path to your own demise. So we thought we would come here and ask you one last time if you would like our help. And Lady Tremaine is like, your help? She's like, you're the reason I'm in this mess. You're the ones that wrote the book of fairy tales, that wrote my fate. I'm the worst makeup artist in the world today. Circe's like, we are your friends, Lady Tremaine. Circe's like, I have been trying to protect you this whole time. I'm the one that made sure you and your husband went into that little shop and got that brooch for you. And didn't I have my sisters deliver the tonic of your salvation? And here I am, once again, offering you help. And Lady Tremaine is like, but I'm in this situation because of you and your bloody book. You are the authors of my demise, not me. And Circe's like, we only write down what prophecy tells us. We can't change what's been written, but we've made it our business to help those that get tangled up in the book's web. That's all we've ever wanted to do. We can rewrite your story, but we need your permission. But Lady Tremaine still didn't understand. Why did you set this situation all in motion just to then offer to help me to get me out of the situation? And Circe's like, because it was written, Lady Tremaine. You were destined to come to the many kingdoms and marry Sir Richard, and his abuse would turn you into a monster that would then in turn cause you to abuse Cinderella. We thought if we could rewrite your story and get that brooch into your possession, it would give you the courage to stand up to him. Lady Tremaine didn't know what to think. She desperately wanted to get her and her daughters out of the many kingdoms. And if having to trust these witches would do that, well, maybe she should. And Circe is like, we can help you escape. You don't have to marry one of your daughters off to this prince. They're like, besides, that fate lies with Cinderella. And Lady Tremaine is like, Cinderella? She's like, she's not even here. And Circe's like, well, she will be, and the prince will want to marry her. It's all written. And Lady Tremaine again is like, well, if it's all written, how can you change my fate? And all the witches in unison say, with magic. And Lady Tremaine is like, but Nanny said that she couldn't use her magic because I'm the villain in this story. And the witches are like, oh, no, she can't use her magic, but we can. The princesses are the fairies' domain, but the villains are ours. We're the villains' fairy godmothers, so to speak. Then, all of a sudden, the fairy godmother comes flying into the ballroom, and she's yelling at the odd sisters, and she's like, I told you to stay away from this ballroom and not to meddle with Cinderella. And Lady Tremaine looks at the fairy godmother, and she's like, are you here to help me? And the fairy godmother is like, help you? A villain? She's like, even if I could, I wouldn't. She's like, you know, when you came here, you weren't a villain, but since then you've become one, and you've encouraged your daughters to be the same. She's like, you deserve what happens next. And Circe speaks up. She's like, we're not here to meddle with Cinderella. We're here to help Lady Tremaine. She's like, Cinderella can have her prince. Just let us help Lady Tremaine. Nanny saw what was really going on, but where is she? Why hasn't she come back to help? And the fairy godmother is like, oh, well, she had to come back to the fairylands and had to be punished. So I'm afraid she won't be remembering much, including Lady Tremaine, for quite some time. And Circe's like, you wiped her memory? And the fairy godmother was like, I had to. She was threatening fairy tradition. And Circe's like, well, mark my words, one of these days she'll be back. The fairy godmother's like, I told Nanny years ago that we would regret letting the odd sisters loose on the mini kingdoms. And Lucinda's like, what do you mean? She's like, I demand that you tell me what you mean right now. And the fairy godmother's like, oh, I've had just about enough with you. You get out of here before I send you to Hades where you belong. And Lucinda's like, go ahead. And Cersei says, yeah, I think he'd probably be happy to see us. And the fairy godmother's like, fine. And she points her wand at the odd sisters, and they go flying back into a spiraling vortex that closes in on them. And Lady Tremaine's like, what happened? Where'd they go? And the fairy godmother's like, never you mind. She's like, it's time for you to get back to your own story. And all of a sudden, everything around snaps back into action. And Lady Tremaine felt a little strange, almost like she had fallen asleep for a quick second. But then she hears Anastasia and Drizella's names be announced. And then the ball goes on as like we see it in the movie. Now, many years passed since the ball, and the chateau began to decay, and so did Lady Tremaine's mind. And everyone in the mini kingdoms kind of just forgot about them, including the odd sisters. And Anastasia and Drizella started to change too. They kind of started to regret how they treated Cinderella. They would sit up in their room at night talking about their childhood and kind of, putting the pieces together. They realized that, Cinderella wasn't the horrible girl that they thought she was at the time. She too had just been controlled by her father. But their most startling revelation in those late night conversations was something they could never tell their mother. It would send her into a rage. So they kept their secret and they just did whatever their mother told them. They wore white wedding dresses. They listened to their mother's ravings. But they did begin to grow tired of living like wraiths. And so they decided that they were going to start standing up to their mother. One day they could hear her ranting. She was like, I've ruined my life. I've ruined my daughter's life. And all for a man who didn't have enough love in his heart for anything but his daughter and his dead wife. And Anastasia's like, well, maybe we could appeal to Cinderella. She's like, I'm sure she would forgive us and help us. And Drizella was like, yeah. She's like, I'm sure she would help us. I know she would forgive us. She's like, when she was a little girl, she didn't know what she was doing, telling Sir Richard about their plan to escape. She's like, in fact, I know she didn't. She'll definitely help us. And Lady Tremaine snapped and she was like, how dare you defend Cinderella? She's like, you know the punishment for defending Cinderella. She goes over to Drizella and she grabs her by the hair. She drags her over to the cellar stairs. And Anastasia and Drizella, they're yelling, no, we don't want to go in the basement. It's cold and it's dark down there. She's like, you're just as bad as Cinderella. She pushes Drizella to the ground and holds her there. She pulls out a pair of scissors from her pocket. She starts hacking away at Drizella's ringlets. And Anastasia is just like frozen in fear watching this. And Lady Tremaine is screaming. She's like, you're a traitor. She's like, do you think I don't know your dirty little secret? Do you think I don't know? She's like, how else would Cinderella have known about our plan to escape unless you told her? Then all of a sudden, we're back to the beginning of the book where the fairy godmother is reading out of the book of fairy tales. She slams the book closed. She's like, I can't take any more of this. She's like, Nanny, you were right. We need to go and we need to help those girls get out of that house. She's like, never thought I would hear myself say this, but I think the odd sisters really were trying to help Lady Tremaine. And Nanny's like, yeah, I know. She's like, It's a shame that they always seem to mess it up. So Nanny and the fairy godmother go flying over there to the chateau. Fairy godmother felt terrible at what she had done. It was because of her that those girls were trapped in that house with their terrible mother. Now that she knew like what Lady Tremaine was capable of doing to her own daughter, she didn't feel bad about what she had done to Lady Tremaine. But Anastasia and Drizella deserved better. Nanny felt terrible too. She should have helped them. She should have been their fairy godmother. And she should have helped Lady Tremaine too before it was too late. But they were going to make up for that now. The fairy godmother turns to Nanny and she says, you know what? She's like, I think you've been right this whole time. She's like, I think the fairies should extend their reach to help those beyond just would-be princesses. And this made Nanny very happy. That has been an ongoing argument throughout this series. So then they go to walk up to the door, and all of a sudden Lady Tremaine flings the door open and she's standing there like looking real pissed off. And the fairy godmother's like, we're here for your daughters. We understand they're in the cellar. And Lady Tremaine, she's looking very cold-hearted. She's like, I will never give you my daughters. She's like, what are you going to do? You're going to let them go? Then where will I be? She starts screaming and yelling and like hacking away with her scissors in the air. And the fairy godmother's like, that is enough out of you. And she points her wand at Lady Tremaine and she disappears into thin air. And Nanny's like, what happened? She's like, I'll tell you later. Right now, we have to get those girls out of the cellar. So they go into the house and they call out to them. They're like, you can come out. It's safe. And the girls look completely traumatized as they come up from the cellar stairs. And the fairy godmother's like, it's okay. She's like, we're here to help you. Cinderella sent us. And she wants to welcome you to court. And Anastasia's like, do you really think she can forgive us? And the fairy godmother's like, oh, dear girl. She's like, she already has. And Anastasia's like, well, we can't go to the castle looking like this. And the fairy godmother's like, that's what fairy godmothers are for. Then the fairy godmother and Nanny transform the girls. They restore their hair and put them in beautiful gowns, including glass slippers. They also returned the house to its former beauty. And then a carriage from the palace shows up. It was sent by Cinderella. And as Anastasia and Drizella are climbing into the carriage, they're like, what happened to our mother? Is she coming back? And the fairy godmother's like, oh, don't you worry about her. She's never going to hurt you again. Now off to the palace, and the carriage pulls away and the girls are smiling and waving goodbye. Then Nanny turns to the fairy godmother and she's like, what did you do with Lady Tremaine? And the fairy godmother's like, well, come on, I'll show you. So she leads Nanny to Cinderella's old attic bedroom. And when she opens the door, Nanny is shocked at what she sees. In the middle of the room, frozen in time, is Lady Tremaine. She's cold and stone-like. And Nanny's like, you turned her into a statue? And the fairy godmother's like, yeah. So Lady Tremaine was now solid, unmovable, and cold, just like she'd always wanted to be. The end. So I think I had a little trouble with the lesson on this one. I think the lesson is not to be the villain in your own story. Not to stand in your own way, maybe? Because, you know, our emotions can really get in the way of our progress. So yeah, that's the backstory of Lady Tremaine. We also finally found out why Nanny hadn't remembered who she was. I know she got her memory back during the Ursula story, but it never really said how exactly. It was like all of a sudden, like, she just acted like she remembered now. Anyway, so that's the explanation for that. So I liked this one. I liked it a lot better than the Cruella one. We did finally get back to the overall arc story. Got to get back to the Odd Sisters and everything that was happening with them. Now remember, when we left them last, they're still like in that place between not quite alive and not quite dead. So I'm hoping in the next story we'll get back to that timeline. And if you want to see that, make sure and subscribe so you don't miss it. And if you liked this story, let me know by giving it a like. It's how I know what kind of videos I should be working on. And if there are any books that you would like me to cover on this channel, just let me know in the comments. I'll do basically any kind of book. I don't just do Disney, I don't just do fairy tales, I do all kinds of books. So let me know if there's something you want to hear a terrible summary of. And I will see you in the next one. Bye! And Lady Tremaine, she's like, they don't deserve this. She's like, bleh. About, right? You know what Lady, no. He had a boyish charm that everybody made, Where is my favorite brush? Where are you? What the heck? Where is it? I don't know. Oh my God, I am just making this worse and worse. What's happening? Terrible. I'm just making this worse and worse. I can't fix it, so. I feel like the worst makeup artist in the world right now. I need to stop, but I can't. I need to stop messing with it, but I can't. Okay. Focus. Remember Mr. Butterpants from the Gothel story? This is I think his losing my mind. Okay. Never gonna get better. And Anastasia and they wore white